You're listening to Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads. I'm Marilyn of Midwest Coven Cast. Here in Season 3 of Weekend Reads, we will be making our way through the 1922 abridgment of Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough. You can visit MidwestCovenCast.com to find podcast extras, including a free online copy of the text. Consider supporting Midwest Coven Cast and Weekend Reads on Patreon for access to additional materials, like a serialized official Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads ebook with additional notes about the text and some editorial modernizations straight from, well, me. Now, Coven, it is time to cozy up with your coffee or tea and enjoy this episode of Weekend Reads. Chapter 3, Subsection 3. Contagious Magic. Thus far, we have been considering chiefly that branch of sympathetic magic, which may be called homeopathic or imitative. Its leading principle, as we have seen, is that like produces like, or in other words, that an effect resembles its cause. The other great branch of sympathetic magic, which I have called contagious magic, proceeds upon the notion that things which have once been conjoined must remain ever afterwards, even when quite dissevered from each other, in such a sympathetic relation that whatever is done to the one must similarly affect the other. Thus, the logical basis of contagious magic, like that of homeopathic magic, is a mistaken association of ideas. Its physical basis, if we may speak of such a thing, like the physical basis of homeopathic magic, is a material medium of some sort, which, like the ether of modern physics, is assumed to unite distant objects and to convey impressions from one to the other. The most familiar example of contagious magic is the magical sympathy which is supposed to exist between a man and any severed portion of his person, as his hair or nails, so that whoever gets possession of human hair or nails may work his will at any distance upon the person from whom they were cut. This superstition is worldwide. Instances of it in regard to hair and nails will be noticed later on in this work. Among the Australian tribes, it was a common practice to knock out one or more of a boy's front teeth at those ceremonies of initiation to which every male member had to submit before he could enjoy the rights and privileges of a full-grown man. The reason of the practice is obscure. All that concerns us here is the belief that a sympathetic relation continued to exist between the lad and his teeth after the latter had been extracted from his gums. Thus, among some of the tribes about the River Darling in New South Wales, the extracted tooth was placed under the bark of a tree near a river or waterhole. If the bark grew over the tooth, or if the tooth fell into the water, all was well. But if it were exposed and the ants ran over it, the natives believed that the boy would suffer from a disease of the mouth. Among the Murring and other tribes of New South Wales, the extracted tooth was at first taken care of by an old man, and then passed from one headman to another, until it had gone all round the community, when it came back to the lad's father, and finally to the lad himself. But however it was thus conveyed from hand to hand, it might on no account be placed in a bag containing magical substances, for to do so would, they believed, put the owner of the tooth in great danger. The late Dr. Howitt once acted as custodian of the teeth, which had been extracted from some novices at a ceremony of initiation, and the old men earnestly besought him not to carry them in a bag in which they knew that he had some quartz crystals. They declared that if he did so, the magic of the crystals would pass into the teeth and so injure the boys. Nearly a year after Dr. Howitt's return from the ceremony, he was visited by one of the principal men of the Murring tribe, who had traveled some 250 miles from his home to fetch back the teeth. This man explained that he had been sent for them because one of the boys had fallen into ill health, and it was believed that the teeth had received some injury which had affected him. He was assured that the teeth had been kept in a box apart from any substances, like quartz crystals, which could influence them, and he returned home bearing the teeth with him, carefully wrapped up and concealed. The Basutos are careful to conceal their extracted teeth, lest these should fall into the hands of certain mythical beings who haunt graves, and who could harm the owner of the tooth by working magic on it. In Sussex, some 50 years ago, a maidservant remonstrated strongly against the throwing away of children's cast teeth, affirming that should they be found and gnawed by an animal, the child's new tooth would be, for all the world, like the teeth of the animal that had bitten the old one. In proof of this, she named old Master Simmons, who had a very large pig's tooth in his upper jaw. A personal defect that he always averred was caused by his mother, who threw away one of his cast teeth by accident into the hog's trough. A similar belief has led to practices intended on the principles of homeopathic magic to replace old teeth by new and better ones. Thus, in many parts of the world, it is customary to put extracted teeth in some place where they will be found by a mouse or rat, in the hope that, through the sympathy which continues to subsist between them and their former owner, his other teeth may acquire the same firmness and excellence as the teeth of those rodents. For example, in Germany, it is said to be an almost universal maxim among the people that when you have had a tooth taken out, you should insert it in a mouse's hole. To do so with a child's milk tooth, which has fallen out, will prevent the child from having toothache. Or you should go behind the stove and throw your tooth backwards over your head, saying, "Mouse, give me your iron tooth. I will give you my bone tooth." After that, your other teeth will remain good. Far away from Europe, at Rarotonga in the Pacific, when a child's tooth was extracted, the following prayer used to be recited: "Big rat, little rat, here is my old tooth. Pray give me a new one." Then the tooth was thrown on the thatch of the house, because rats make their nests in the decayed thatch. The reason assigned for invoking the rats on these occasions was that rats' teeth were the strongest known to the natives. Other parts which are commonly believed to remain in a sympathetic union with the body after the physical connection has been severed are the navel string and the afterbirth, including the placenta. So intimate, indeed, is the union conceived to be, that the fortunes of the individual for good or evil throughout life are often supposed to be bound up with one or other of these portions of his person, so that if his navel string or afterbirth is preserved and properly treated, he will be prosperous, whereas if it be injured or lost, he will suffer accordingly. Thus, certain tribes of Western Australia believe that a man swims well or ill, according as his mother at his birth threw the navel string into water or not. Among the natives on the Pennyfeather River in Queensland, it is believed that a part of the child's spirit, Choai, stays in the afterbirth. Hence, the grandmother takes the afterbirth away and buries it in the sand. She marks the spot by a number of twigs, which she sticks in the ground in a circle, tying their tops together so that the structure resembles a cone. When Anhea, the being who causes conception in women by putting mud babies into their wombs, comes along and sees the place, he takes out the spirit and carries it away to one of his haunts, such as a tree, a hole in a rock or lagoon, where it may remain for years. But some time or other he will put the spirit again into the baby, and it will be born once more into the world. In Ponape, one of the Caroline Islands, the navel string is placed in a shell and then disposed of in such a way as shall best adapt the child for the career which the parents have chosen for him. For example, if they wish to make him a good climber, they will hang the navel string on a tree. The Key Islanders regard the navel string as the brother or sister of the child, according to the sex of the infant. They put it in a pot with ashes and set it in the branches of a tree, that it may keep watchful eye on the fortunes of its comrade. Among the Bataks of Sumatra, as among many other peoples of the Indian archipelago, the placenta passes for a child's younger brother or sister, the sex being determined by the sex of the child, and it is buried under the house. According to the Bataks, it is bound up with the child's welfare, and seems, in fact, to be the seat of the transferable soul, of which we shall hear something later on. The Karo Bataks even affirm that of a man's two souls, it is the true soul that lives with the placenta under the house. That is the soul, they say, which begets children. The Baganda believe that every person is born with a double, and this double they identify with the afterbirth, which they regard as a second child. The mother buries the afterbirth at the root of a plantain tree, which then becomes sacred until the fruit has ripened, when it is plucked to furnish a sacred feast for the family. Among the Cherokees, the navel string of a girl is buried under a corn mortar, in order that the girl may grow up to be a good baker. but the navel string of a boy is hung up on a tree in the woods in order that he may be a hunter. The Incas of Peru preserved the navel string with the greatest care and gave it to the child to suck whenever it fell ill. In ancient Mexico, they used to give a boy's navel string to soldiers to be buried by them on a field of battle in order that the boy might thus acquire a passion for war. But the navel string of a girl was buried beside the domestic hearth, because this was believed to inspire her with a love of home and a taste for cooking and baking. Even in Europe, many people still believe that a person's destiny is more or less bound up with that of his navel string or afterbirth. Thus, in Rhenish Bavaria, the navel string is kept for a while wrapped up in a piece of old linen, and then cut or pricked to pieces, according as the child is a boy or girl, in order that he or she may grow up to be a skillful workman or a good seamstress. In Berlin, the midwife commonly delivers the dried navel string to the father, with a strict injunction to preserve it carefully. For so long as it is kept, the child will live and thrive, and be free from sickness. In Bough and Perch, the people are careful to throw the navel string neither into water nor into fire, believing that if that were done, the child would be drowned or burned. Thus, in many parts of the world, the navel string, or more commonly the afterbirth, is regarded as a living being, the brother or sister of the infant, or as the material object in which the guardian spirit of the child, or part of its soul, resides. Further, the sympathetic connection supposed to exist between a person and his afterbirth or navel string comes out very clearly in the widespread custom of treating the afterbirth or navel string in ways which are supposed to influence for life the character and career of the person making him, if it is a man, a nimble climber, a strong swimmer, a skillful hunter, or a brave soldier, and making her, if it is a woman, a cunning seamstress, a good baker, and so forth. Thus, the beliefs and usages concerned with the afterbirth or placenta, and to a less extent with the navel string, present a remarkable parallel to the widespread doctrine of the transferable or external soul and the customs founded on it. Hence, it is hardly rash to conjecture that the resemblance is no mere chance coincidence, but that in the afterbirth or placenta we have a physical basis, not necessarily the only one, for the theory and practice of the external soul. The consideration of that subject is reserved for a later part of this work. A curious application of the doctrine of contagious magic is the relation commonly believed to exist between a wounded man and the agent of the wound, so that whatever is subsequently done by or to the agent must correspondingly affect the patient either for good or evil. Thus Pliny tells us that if you have wounded a man and are sorry for it, you have only to spit on the hand that gave the wound, and the pain of the sufferer will be instantly alleviated. In Melanesia, if a man's friends get possession of the arrow which wounded him, they keep it in a damp place or in cool leaves, for then the inflammation will be trifling and will soon subside. Meantime, the enemy who shot the arrow is hard at work to aggravate the wound by all the means in his power. For this purpose, he and his friends drink hot and burning juices, and chew irritating leaves, for this will clearly inflame and irritate the wound. Further, they keep the bow near the fire to make the wound which it has inflicted hot. And for the same reason, they put the arrowhead, if it has been recovered, into the fire. Moreover, they are careful to keep the bowstring taut, and to twang it occasionally, for this will cause the wounded man to suffer from tension of the nerves and spasms of tetanus. It is constantly received and avouched, says Bacon, that the anointing of the weapon that maketh the wound will heal the wound itself. In this experiment upon the relation of men of credit, though myself as yet am not fully inclined to believe it, you shall note the points following. First, the ointment wherewith this is done is made of diverse ingredients, whereof the strangest and hardest to come by are the moss upon the skull of a dead man unburied, and the fats of a boar and bear killed in the act of generation. The precious ointment, compounded out of these and other ingredients, was applied, as the philosopher explains, not to the wound, but to the weapon, and that even though the injured man was a great distance and knew nothing about it, the experiment, he tells us, had been tried of wiping the ointment off the weapon without the knowledge of the person hurt, with the result that he was presently in a great rage of pain until the weapon was anointed again. Moreover, it is affirmed that if you cannot get the weapon, Yet if you put an instrument of iron or wood resembling the weapon into the wound whereby it bleedeth, the anointing of that instrument will serve and work the effect. Remedies of the sort which Bacon deemed worthy of his attention are still in vogue in the eastern countries of England. Thus in Suffolk, if a man cuts himself with a bill-hook or a scythe, he always takes care to keep the weapon bright, and oils it to prevent the wound from festering. If he runs a thorn, or as he calls it, a bush, into his hand, he oils or greases the extracted thorn. A man came to the doctor with an inflamed hand, having run a thorn into it while he was hedging. On being told that the hand was festering, he remarked, "That didn't ought to, for I greased the bush well after I pulled it out." If a horse wounds its foot by treading on a nail, a Suffolk groom will invariably preserve the nail, clean it, and grease it every day to prevent the foot from festering. Similarly, Cambridgeshire labourers think that if a horse has run a nail into its foot, it is necessary to grease the nail with lard or oil and put it away in some safe place, or the horse will not recover. A few years ago, a veterinarian surgeon was sent for to attend a horse which had ripped its side open on the hinge of a farm gatepost. On arriving at the farm, he found that nothing had been done to the wounded horse, but that a man was busy trying to pry the hinge out of the gatepost in order that it might be greased and put away, which, in the opinion of the Cambridge wiseacres, would conduce to the recovery of the animal. Similarly, Essex rustics opine that if a man has been stabbed with a knife, it is essential to his recovery that the knife should be greased and laid across the bed on which the sufferer is lying. So in Bavaria, you are directed to anoint a linen rag with grease and tie it on the edge of the axe that cut you, taking care to keep the sharp edge upwards. As the grease on the axe dries, your wound heals. Similarly, in the Harz Mountains, they say that if you cut yourself, you ought to smear the knife or the scissors with fat and put the instrument away in a dry place in the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. As the knife dries, the wound heals. Other people, however, in Germany, say that you should stick the knife in some damp place in the ground, and that your hurt will heal as the knife rusts. Others again, in Bavaria, recommend you to smear the axe, or whatever it is, with blood, and put it under the eaves. The train of reasoning which thus commends itself to English and German rustics, in common with the savages of Melanesia and America, is carried a step farther by the aborigines of Central Australia, who conceive that under certain circumstances the near relations of a wounded man must grease themselves, restrict their diet, and regulate their behavior in other ways in order to ensure his recovery. Thus, when a lad has been circumcised and the wound is not yet healed, his mother may not eat a possum, or a certain kind of lizard, or carpet snake, or any kind of fat, for otherwise she would retard the healing of the boy's wound. Every day she greases her digging sticks, and never lets them out of her sight. At night she sleeps with them close to her head. No one is allowed to touch them. Every day, also, she rubs her body all over with grease, as in some way this is believed to help her son's recovery. Another refinement of the same principle is due to the ingenuity of the German peasant. It is said that when one of his pigs or sheep breaks a leg, a farmer of Rhenish Bavaria, or Hesse, will bind up the leg of a chair with bandages and splints in due form. For some days thereafter, no one may sit in that chair, move it, or knock up against it, for to do so would pain the injured pig or sheep and hinder the cure. In this last case, it is clear that we have passed wholly out of the region of contagious magic and into the region of homeopathic or imitative magic. The chair leg, which is treated instead of the beast's leg, in no sense belongs to the animal, and the application of bandages to it is a mere simulation of the treatment which a more rational surgery would bestow on the real patient. The sympathetic connection supposed to exist between the man and the weapon which has wounded him is probably founded on the notion that the blood on the weapon continues to feel the blood in his body. For a like reason, the Papuans of Tumleo, an island off New Guinea, are careful to throw into the sea the bloody bandages with which their wounds have been dressed, for they fear that if these rags fell into the hands of an enemy, he might injure them magically thereby. Once, when a man with a wound in his mouth, which bled constantly, came to the missionaries to be treated, His faithful wife took great pains to collect all the blood and cast it into the sea. Strained and unnatural as this idea may seem to us, it is perhaps less so than the belief that magic sympathy is maintained between a person and his clothes, so that whatever is done to the clothes will be felt by the man himself, even though he may be far away at the time. In the Watjobelik tribe of Victoria, a wizard would sometimes get hold of a man's opossum rug and roast it slowly in the fire, and as he did so, the owner of the rug would fall sick. If the wizard consented to undo the charm, he would give the rug back to the sick man's friends, bidding them put it in water so as to wash the fire out. When that happened, the sufferer would feel a refreshing coolness and probably recover. In Tana, one of the New Hebrides, a man who had a grudge at another and desired his death would try to get possession of a cloth which had touched the sweat of his enemy's body. If he succeeded, he rubbed the cloth carefully over with leaves and twigs of a certain tree, rolled in bound cloth, twigs, and leaves into a long sausage-shaped bundle, and turned it slowly in the fire. As the bundle was consumed, the victim fell ill, and when it was reduced to ashes, he died. In this last form of enchantment, however, the magical sympathy may be supposed to exist, not so much between the man and the cloth, as between the man and the sweat which issued from his body. But in other cases of the same sort, it seems that the garment by itself is enough to give the sorcerer a hold upon his victim. The witch in Theocritus, while she melted an image or lump of wax in order that her faithless lover might melt with love of her, did not forget to throw into the fire a shred of his cloak, which he had dropped in her house. In Prussia, they say that if you cannot catch a thief, the next best thing you can do is to get hold of a garment which he may have shed in his flight, for if you beat it soundly, the thief will fall sick. This belief is firmly rooted in the popular mind. Some 80 or 90 years ago, in the neighborhood of Berend, a man was detected trying to steal honey, and fled, leaving his coat behind him. When he heard that the enraged owner of the honey was mauling his lost coat, he was so alarmed that he took to his bed and died. Again, magic may be wrought on a man sympathetically, not only through his clothes and severed parts of himself, but also through the impressions left by his body in sand or earth. In particular, it is a worldwide superstition that by injuring footprints, you injure the feet that made them. Thus, the natives of southeastern Australia think that they can lame a man by placing sharp pieces of quartz glass, bone, or charcoal in his footprints. Rheumatic pains are often attributed by them to this cause. Seeing a Tutungulung man very lame, Mr. Howitt asked him what was the matter. He said, "Some fellow has put bottle in my foot." He was suffering from rheumatism, but believed that an enemy had found his foot track and had buried in it a piece of broken bottle, the magical influence of which had entered his foot. Similar practices prevail in various parts of Europe. Thus, in Mecklenburg, it is thought that if you drive a nail into a man's footprint, he will fall lame. Sometimes it is required that the nail should be taken from a coffin. A like mode of injuring an enemy is resorted to in some parts of France. It is said that there was an old woman who used a frequent stow in Suffolk, and she was a witch. If, while she walked, anyone went after her and stuck a nail or knife into her footprint in the dust, the dame would not stir a step till it was withdrawn. Among the South Slavs, a girl will dig up the earth from the footprints of the man she loves and put it in a flower pot. Then she plants in the pot a marigold, a flower that is thought to be fadeless. And as its golden blossom grows and blooms and never fades, so shall her sweetheart's love grow and bloom and never fade. Thus the love spell acts on the man through the earth he trod on. An old Danish mode of concluding a treaty was based on the same idea of the sympathetic connection between a man and his footprints. The covenanting parties sprinkled each other's footprints with their own blood, thus giving a pledge of fidelity. In ancient Greece, superstitions of the same sort seem to have been current, for it was thought that if a horse stepped on the track of a wolf, he was seized with numbness, and a maxim ascribed to Pythagoras forbade people to pierce a man's footprints with a nail or knife. The same superstition is turned to account by hunters in many parts of the world for the purpose of running down the game. Thus, a German huntsman will stick a nail taken from a coffin into the fresh spoor of the quarry, believing this will hinder the animal from escaping. The Aborigines of Victoria put hot embers in the tracks of the animals they were pursuing. Hottentot hunters throw into the air a handful of sand taken from the footprints of the game, believing that this will bring the animal down. The Thompson Indians used to lay charms on the tracks of wounded deer. After that, they deemed it superfluous to pursue the animal any farther that day, for being thus charmed, it could not travel far and would soon die. Similarly, Ojibwe Indians placed medicine on the track of the first deer or bear they met with, supposing that this would soon bring the animal into sight, even if it were 2 or 3 days' journey off, for this charm had power to compress a journey of several days into a few hours. U-hunters of West Africa stab the footprints of game with a sharp pointed stick in order to maintain the quarry and allow them to come up with it. But though the footprint is the most obvious, it is not the only impression made by the body through which magic may be wrought on a man. The Aborigines of southeastern Australia believe that a man may be injured by burying sharp fragments of quartz, glass, and so forth in the mark made by his reclining body. The magical virtue of these sharp things enters his body and causes those acute pains which the ignorant European puts down to rheumatism. We can now understand why it was a maxim with the Pythagoreans that in rising from your bed you should smooth away the impression left by your body on the bedclothes. The rule was simply an old precaution against magic, forming part of a whole code of superstitious maxims, which antiquity fathered on Pythagoras, though doubtless they were familiar to the barbarous forefathers of the Greeks long before the time of that philosopher. Subsection 4. The Magician's Progress. We have now concluded our examination of the general principles of sympathetic magic. The examples by which I have illustrated them have been drawn for the most part from what may be called private magic, that is, from magical rites and incantations practiced for the benefit or the injury of individuals. But in savage society, there is commonly to be found in addition what we may call public magic, that is, sorcery practiced for the benefit of the whole community. Wherever ceremonies of this sort are observed for the common good, it is obvious that the magician ceases to be merely a private practitioner and becomes to some extent a public functionary. The development of such a class of functionaries is of great importance for the political as well as the religious evolution of society. For when the welfare of the tribe is supposed to depend on the performance of these magical rites, the magician rises into a position of much influence and repute, and may readily acquire the rank and authority of a chief or king. The profession, accordingly, draws into the ranks some of the ablest and most ambitious men of the tribe, because it holds out to them a prospect of honor, wealth, and power, such as hardly any other career could offer. The acuter minds perceive how easy it is to dupe their weaker brother, and to play on his superstition for their own advantage. Not that the sorcerer is always a knave and impostor. He is often sincerely convinced that he really possesses those wonderful powers which the credulity of his fellows ascribes to him. But the more sagacious he is, the more likely he is to see through the fallacies which impose on duller wits. Thus the ablest members of the profession must tend to be more or less conscious deceivers, and it is just these men who, in virtue of their superior ability, will generally come to the top and win for themselves positions of the highest dignity and the most commanding authority. The pitfalls which beset the path of the professional sorcerer are many, and as a rule, only the man of coolest head and sharpest wit will be able to steer his way through them safely. For it must always be remembered that every single profession and claim put forward by the magician as such is false. Not one of them can be maintained without deception, conscious or unconscious. Accordingly, the sorcerer who sincerely believes in his own extravagant pretensions is in far greater peril, and is much more likely to be cut short in his career than the deliberate impostor. The honest wizard always expects that his charms and incantations will produce their supposed effect. And when they fail, not only really, as they always do, but conspicuously and disastrously, as they often do, he is taken aback. He is not, like his knavish colleague, ready with a plausible excuse to account for the failure, and before he can find one, he may be knocked on the head by his disappointed and angry employers. The general result is that at this stage of social evolution, the supreme power tends to fall into the hands of men of the keenest intelligence and the most unscrupulous character. If we could balance the harm they do by their knavery against the benefits they confer by their superior sagacity, it might well be found that the good greatly outweighed the evil. For more mischief has probably been wrought in the world by honest fools in high places than by intelligent rascals. Once your shrewd rogue has attained the highest of his ambition, and has no longer any selfish end to further, he may, and often does, turn his talents, his experience, his resources, to the service of the public. Many men who have been least scrupulous in the acquisition of power have been most beneficent in the use of it, whether the power they aimed at and won was that of wealth, political authority, or what not. In the field of politics, the wily intriguer, the ruthless victor, may end up by being a wise and magnanimous ruler, blessed in his lifetime, lamented at his death, admired and applauded by posterity. Such men, to take two of the most conspicuous instances, were Julius Caesar and Augustus. But once a fool, always a fool. And the greater the power in his hands, the more disastrous is likely to be the use he makes of it. The heaviest calamity in English history, the breach with America, might never have occurred if George III had not been an honest dullard. Thus, so far as the public profession of magic affected the constitution of savage society, it tended to place the control of affairs in the hands of the ablest man. It shifted the balance of power from the many to the one. It substituted a monarchy for a democracy, or rather for an oligarchy of old men. For in general, the savage community is ruled not by the whole body of adult males, but by a council of elders. The change, by whatever causes produced, and whatever the character of the early rulers, was on the whole very beneficial. For the rise of monarchy appears to be an essential condition of the emergence of mankind from savagery. No human being is so hidebound by custom and tradition as your democratic savage. In no state of society, consequently, is progress so slow and difficult. The old notion that the savage is the freest of mankind is the reverse of the truth. He is a slave, not indeed to a visible master, but to the past, to the spirits of his dead forefathers, who haunt his steps from birth to death, and rule him with a rod of iron. What they did is the pattern of right, the unwritten law to which he yields a blind, unquestioning obedience. The least possible scope is thus afforded to superior talent, to change old customs for the better. The ablest man is dragged down by the weakest and dullest, who necessarily sets the standard, since he cannot rise while the others can fall. The surface of such a society presents a uniform dead level, so far as it is humanly possible to reduce the natural inequalities, the immeasurable real differences of inborn capacity and temper, to a false superficial appearance of equality. From this low and stagnant condition of affairs, which demagogues and dreamers in later times have lauded as the ideal state, the golden age of humanity, everything that helps to raise society by opening a career to talent and proportioning the degrees of authority to men's natural abilities, deserves to be welcomed by all who have the real good of their fellows at heart. Once these elevating influences have begun to operate, and they cannot be forever suppressed, the progress of civilization becomes comparatively rapid. The rise of one man to supreme power enables him to carry through changes in a single lifetime, which previously many generations might not have sufficed to effect. And if, as will often happen, he is a man of intellect and energy above the common, he will readily avail himself of the opportunity. Even the whims and caprices of a tyrant may be of service in breaking the chain of custom which lies so heavy on the savage. And as soon as the tribe ceases to be swayed by the timid and divided counsels of the elders, and yields to the direction of a single strong and resolute mind, it becomes formidable to its neighbors, and enters on a career of aggrandizement, which at an early stage of history is often highly favorable to social, industrial, and intellectual progress. For extending its sway partly by force of arms, partly by the voluntary submission of weaker tribes, the community soon requires wealth and slaves, both of which, by relieving some classes from the perpetual struggle for a bare subsistence, afford them an opportunity of devoting themselves to that disinterested pursuit of knowledge, which is the noblest and most powerful instrument to ameliorate the lot of man. Intellectual progress, which reveals itself in the growth of art and science and the spread of more liberal views, cannot be dissociated from the industrial or economic progress that in its turn receives an immense impulse from conquest and empire. It is no mere accident that the most vehement outbursts of activity of the human mind have followed close on the heels of victory, and that the great conquering races of the world have commonly done most to advance and spread civilization, thus healing in peace the wounds they inflicted in war. The Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs are our witnesses in the past. We may yet live to see similar outbursts in Japan, nor to remount the stream of history to its sources, is it an accident that all the first great strides towards civilization have been made under despotic and theocratic governments, like those of Egypt, Babylon, and Peru, where the supreme ruler claimed and received the servile allegiance of his subjects in the double character of a king and a god. It is hardly too much to say that this early epic despotism is the best friend of humanity, and, as paradoxical as it may sound, of liberty. For after all, there is more liberty, in the best sense, liberty to think our own thoughts, and to fashion our own destinies, under the most absolute despotism, the most grinding tyranny, than under the apparent freedom of savage life, where the individual's lot is cast from the cradle to the grave in the iron mold of hereditary custom. So far, therefore, as the public profession of magic has been one of the roads by which the ablest men have passed to supreme power, it has contributed to emancipate mankind from the thraldom of tradition, and to elevate them into a larger, freer life, with a broader outlook on the world. This is no small service rendered to humanity, and when we remember further that in another direction magic has paved the way for science, we are forced to admit that if the black art has done much evil, it has also been the source of much good, that if it is the child of error, it has yet been the mother of freedom and truth. Chapter 4. Magic and Religion. The examples collected in the last chapter may suffice to illustrate the general principles of sympathetic magic in its two branches, to which we have given the names of homeopathic and contagious respectively. In some cases of magic, which have come before us, we have seen that the operation of spirits is assumed, and that an attempt is made to win their favor by prayer and sacrifice. But these cases are on the whole exceptional. They exhibit magic tinged and alloyed with religion. Wherever sympathetic magic occurs in its pure, unadulterated form, it assumes that in nature one event follows another necessarily and invariably without the intervention of any spiritual or personal agency. Thus, its fundamental conception is identical with that of modern science. Underlying the whole system is a faith, implicit but real and firm, in the order and uniformity of nature. The magician does not doubt that the same causes will always produce the same effects, that the performance of the proper ceremony accompanied by the appropriate spell will inevitably be attended by the desired result, unless, indeed, his incantations should chance to be thwarted and foiled by the more potent charms of another sorcerer. He supplicates no higher power. He sues the favor of no fickle and wayward being. He abases himself before no awful deity. Yet his power, great as he believes it to be, is by no means arbitrary and unlimited. He can wield it only so long as he strictly conforms to the rules of his art, or to what may be called the laws of nature as conceived by him. To neglect these rules, to break these laws in the smallest particular, is to incur failure, and may even expose the unskillful practitioner himself to the utmost peril. If he claims a sovereignty over nature, it is a constitutional sovereignty rigorously limited in its scope and exercised in exact conformity with ancient usage. Thus, the analogy between the magical and the scientific conceptions of the world is close. In both of them, the succession of events is assumed to be perfectly regular and certain, being determined by immutable laws, the operation of which can be foreseen and calculated precisely. The elements of caprice, of chance, and of accident are banished from the course of nature. Both of them open up a seemingly boundless vista of possibilities to him who knows the causes of things and can touch the secret springs that set in motion the vast and intricate mechanisms of the world. Hence the strong attraction which magic and science alike have exercised on the human mind. Hence the powerful stimulus that both have given to the pursuit of knowledge. They lure the weary inquirer, the footsore seeker, on through the wilderness of disappointment in the present by their endless promises of the future. They take him up to the top of an exceeding high mountain, and show him, beyond the dark clouds and rolling mists at his feet, a vision of the celestial city. Far off it may be, but radiant and unearthly splendor bathed in the light of dreams. The fatal flaw of magic lies not in its general assumption of a sequence of events determined by law, but in its total misconception of the nature of the particular laws which govern that sequence. If we analyze the various cases of sympathetic magic which have been passed in review in the preceding pages, and which may be taken as fair samples of the bulk, we shall find, as I have already indicated, that they are all mistaken applications of one or other of two great fundamental laws of thought, namely, the association of ideas by similarity, and the association of ideas by contiguity in space or time. A mistaken association of similar ideas produces homeopathic or imitative magic. A mistaken association of contagious ideas produces contagious magic. The principles of association are excellent in themselves, and indeed absolutely essential to the working of the human mind. Legitimately applied, they yield science. Illegitimately applied, they yield magic, the bastard sister of science. It is therefore a truism, almost a tautology, to say that all magic is necessarily false and barren. For were it ever to become true and fruitful, it would no longer be magic, but science. From the earliest of times, man has been engaged in a search for general rules, whereby to turn the order of natural phenomena to his own advantage, and in the long search he has scraped together a great hoard of such maxims. Some of them golden, some of them mere dross. The true or golden rules constitute the body of applied science, which we call the arts. The false are magic. If magic is thus next of kin to science, we have still to inquire how it stands related to religion. But the view we take of that relation will necessarily be colored by the idea which we have formed of the nature of religion itself. Hence, a writer may reasonably be expected to define his conception of religion before he proceeds to investigate its relation to magic. There is probably no subject in the world about which opinions differ so much as the nature of religion, and to frame a definition of it which would satisfy everyone must obviously be impossible. All that a writer can do is, first, to say clearly what he means by religion, and afterwards to employ the word consistently in that sense throughout his work. By religion, then, I understand a propitiation or consolation of powers superior to man, which are believed to direct and control the course of nature and of human life. Thus defined, religion consists of two elements, a theoretical and a practical, namely, a belief in powers higher than man and an attempt to propitiate or please them. Of the two, belief clearly comes first, since we must believe in the existence of a divine being before we can attempt to please him. But unless the belief leads to a corresponding practice, it is not a religion, but merely a theology. In the language of St. James, faith, if it hath not works, is dead being alone. In other words, no man is religious who does not govern his conduct in some measure by the fear or love of God. On the other hand, mere practice, divested of all religious belief, is also not religion. Two men may behave in exactly the same way, and yet one of them may be religious, and the other not. If the one acts from the love or fear of God, he is religious. If the other acts from the love or fear of man, he is moral or immoral, according as his behavior comports or conflicts with the general good. Hence belief and practice, or, in theological language, faith and works, are equally essential to religion, which cannot exist without both of them. But it is not necessary that religious practice should always take the form of a ritual. That is, it need not consist in the offering of sacrifice, the recitation of prayers, and other outward ceremonies. Its aim is to please the deity. And if the deity is one who delights in charity and mercy and purity more than in oblations of blood, the chanting of hymns, and the fumes of incense, his worshippers will best please him, not by prostrating themselves before him, by anointing his praises, and by filling his temples with costly gifts, but by being pure and merciful and charitable towards men, for in so doing they will imitate, so far as human infirmity allows, the perfections of the divine nature. It was this ethical side of religion which the Hebrew prophets, inspired with a noble ideal of God's goodness and holiness, were never weary of inculcating. Thus Micah says, He hath shewed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. And at a later time, much of the force by which Christianity conquered the world was drawn from the same high conception of God's moral nature, and the duty laid on men of conforming themselves to it. Pure religion and undefiled, says St. James, before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. But if religion involves first a belief in superhuman beings who rule the world, and second an attempt to win their favor, it clearly assumes that the course of nature is to some extent elastic or variable, and that we can persuade or induce the mighty beings who control it to deflect, for our benefit, the current of events from the channel in which they would otherwise flow. Now, this implied elasticity or variability of nature is directly opposed to the principles of magic as well as of science, both of which assume that the processes of nature are rigid and invariable in their operation, and that they can as little be turned from their course by persuasion and entreaty as by threats and intimidation. The distinction between the two conflicting views of the universe turns on their answer to the crucial question: are the forces which govern the world conscious and personal, or unconscious and impersonal? Religion, as a consolation of the superhuman powers, assumes the former member of the alternative, for all conciliation implies that the being conciliated is a conscious or personal agent, and his conduct is in some measure uncertain, and that he can be prevailed upon to vary it in the desired direction by a judicious appeal to his interests, his appetites, or his emotions. Conciliation is never employed towards things which are regarded as inanimate, nor towards persons whose behavior in the particular circumstances is known to be determined with absolute certainty. Thus, in so far as religion assumes the world to be directed by conscious agents who may be turned from their purpose by persuasion, it stands in fundamental antagonism to magic, as well as to science, both of which take for granted that the course of nature is determined not by the passions or caprice of personal beings, but by the operation of immutable laws acting mechanically. In magic, indeed, the assumption is only implicit, but in science it is explicit. It is true that magic often deals with spirits, which are personal agents of the kind assumed by religion. But whenever it does so in its proper form, it treats them exactly in the same fashion as it treats inanimate agents. That is, it constrains or coerces instead of conciliating or propitiating them as religion would do. Thus it assumes that all personal beings, whether human or divine, are in the last resort subject to those impersonal forces which control all things, but which nevertheless can be turned to account by any one who knows how to manipulate them by the appropriate ceremonies and spells. In ancient Egypt, for example, the magicians claimed the power of compelling even the highest gods to do their bidding, and actually threatened them with destruction in case of disobedience. Sometimes, without going quite so far as that, the wizard declared that he would scatter the bones of Osiris, or reveal his sacred legend, if the god proved contumacious. Similarly, in India, at the present day, the great Hindu trinity itself of Brahma, Vishnu, and Siva is subject to the sorcerers, who by means of their spells exercise such an ascendancy over the mightiest deities, that these are bound submissively to execute on earth below, or in heaven above, whatever commands their masters, the magicians, may please to issue. There is a saying everywhere current in India: the whole universe is subject to the gods are subject to the spells, mantras, the spells to the Brahmins, therefore the Brahmins are our gods. This radical conflict of principle between magic and religion sufficiently explains the relentless hostility with which, in history, the priest has often pursued the magician. The haughty self-sufficiency of the magician, his arrogant demeanor towards the higher powers, and his unabashed claim to exercise a sway like theirs, could not but revolt the priest, to whom, with his awful sense of the divine majesty and his humble prostration in presence of it, Such claims and such a demeanor must have appeared an impious and blasphemous usurpation of prerogatives that belong to God alone. And sometimes we may suspect lower motives concurred to whet the edge of the priest's hostility. He professed to be the proper medium, the true intercessor between God and man, and no doubt his interests as well as his feelings were often injured by a rival practitioner, whom preached a surer and smoother road to fortune than the rugged and slippery path of divine favor. Yet this antagonism, familiar as it is to us, seems to have made its appearance comparatively late in the history of religion. At an earlier stage, the functions of priest and sorcerer were often combined, or, to speak perhaps more correctly, were not yet differentiated from each other. To serve his purpose, man wooed the goodwill of gods or spirits by prayer and sacrifice, while at the same time he had recourse to ceremonies and forms of words which he hoped would of themselves bring about the desired result without the help of God or devil. In short, he performed religious and magical rites simultaneously. He uttered prayers and incantations almost in the same breath, knowing or reckoning little of the theoretical inconsistency of his behavior, so long as by hook or crook he contrived to get what he wanted. Instances of this fusion or confusion of magic with religion have already met us in the practices of Melanesians and of other peoples. The same confusion of magic and religion has survived among peoples that have risen to higher levels of culture. It was rife in ancient India and ancient Egypt. It is by no means extinct among European peasantry at the present day. With regard to ancient India, we are told by an eminent Sanskrit scholar that the sacrificial ritual, at the earliest period of which we have detailed information, is pervaded with practices that breathe the spirit of the most primitive magic. Speaking of the importance of magic in the East, and especially in Egypt, Professor Maspero remarks that we ought not to attach to the word magic the degrading idea which it almost inevitably calls up in the mind of a modern. Ancient magic was the very foundation of religion. The faithful who desired to obtain some favor from a god had no chance of succeeding except by laying hands on the deity, and this arrest could only be effected by means of a certain number of rites, sacrifices, prayers, and chants, which the god himself had revealed, and which obliged him to do what was demanded of him. Among the ignorant classes of modern Europe, the same confusion of ideas, the same mixture of religion and magic, crops up in various forms. Thus, we are told that in France, the majority of the peasants still believe that the priest possesses a secret and irresistible power over the elements. By citing certain prayers which he alone knows and has the right to utter, yet for the utterances of which he must afterwards demand absolution, he can, on an occasion of pressing danger, arrest or reverse for a moment the action of the eternal laws of the physical world. The winds, the storms, the hail, and the rain are at his command and obey his will. The fire also is subject to him, and the flames of a conflagration are extinguished at his word. For example, French peasants used to be, perhaps are still, persuaded that the priests could celebrate, with certain special rites, a Mass of the Holy Spirit, of which the efficacy was so miraculous that it never met with any opposition from the divine will. God was forced to grant whatever was asked of him in this form, however rash and inopportune might be the petition. No idea of impiety or irreverence attached to the rite in the minds of those who, in some of the great extremities of life, sought by this singular means to take the kingdom of heaven by storm. The secular priests generally refused to say the Mass of the Holy Spirit, but the monks, especially the Capuchin friars, had the reputation of yielding with less scruple to the entreaties of the anxious and distressed. In the constraint thus supposed by Catholic peasantry to be laid by the priest upon the deity, we seem to have an exact counterpart of the power which the ancient Egyptians ascribed to their magicians. Again, to take another example, in many villages of Providence, the priest is still reputed to possess the faculty of averting storms. It is not every priest who enjoys this reputation, and in some villages, when a change of pastors take place, the parishioners are eager to learn whether the new incumbent has the powder, as they call it. At the first sign of a heavy storm, they put him to the proof by inviting him to exorcise the threatening clouds, and if the result answers to their hopes, The new shepherd is assured of the sympathy and respect of his flock. In some parishes, where the reputation of the curate in this respect stood higher than that of his rector, the relations between the two have been so strained in consequence that the bishop has had to translate the rector to another benefice. Again, Gascon peasants believe that to revenge themselves on their enemies, bad men will sometimes induce a priest to say a mass called the Mass of Saint Sécaire. Very few priests know this mass, and 3/4 of those who do know it would not say it for love or money. None but wicked priests dare to perform the gruesome ceremony, and you may be quite sure that they will have a very heavy account to render for it at the last day. No curate or bishop, not even the Archbishop of Auch, can pardon them. That right belongs to the Pope of Rome alone. The Mass of Saint Sécaire may be said only in a ruined or deserted church, where owls mope and hoot, where bats flit in the gloaming, where gypsies lodge of nights, and where toads squat under the desecrated altar. Thither the bad priests come by night with this light o' love, and at the first stroke of 11 he begins to mumble the mass backwards, and ends just as the clocks are knelling the midnight hour. His leman acts as clerk. The host he blesses is black, and has 3 points. He consecrates no wine, but instead he drinks the water of a well into which the body of an unbaptized infant has been flung. He makes the sign of the cross, but it is on the ground and with his left foot, and many other things he does, which no good Christian could look upon without being struck blind and deaf and dumb for the rest of his life. But the man for whom the Mass is said withers away little by little, and nobody can say what is the matter with him. Even the doctors can make nothing of it. They do not know that he is slowly dying of the Mass of Saint Sécaire. Yet though magic is thus found to fuse and amalgamate with religion in many ages and in many lands, there are some grounds for thinking that this fusion is not primitive, and that there was a time when man trusted to magic alone for the satisfaction of such wants as transcended his immediate animal cravings. In the first place, a consideration of the fundamental notions of magic and religion may incline us to surmise that magic is older than religion in the history of humanity. We have seen that on the one hand, magic is nothing but a mistaken application of the very simplest and most elementary processes of the mind, namely the association of ideas by virtue of resemblance or contiguity, and that on the other hand, religion assumes the operation of conscious or personal agents, superior to man, behind the visible screen of nature. Obviously, the conception of personal agents is more complex than a simple recognition of the similarity or contiguity of ideas, and a theory which assumes that the course of nature is determined by conscious agents is more abstruse and recondite, and requires for its apprehension a far higher degree of intelligence and reflection than the view that things succeed each other simply by reason of their contiguity or resemblance. The very beasts associate the ideas of things that are like each other, or that have been found together in their experience, and they could hardly survive for a day if they ceased to do so. But who attributes to the animals a belief that the phenomena of nature are worked by a multitude of invisible animals, or by one enormous and prodigiously strong animal behind the scenes? It is probably no injustice to the brutes to assume that the honor of devising a theory of this latter sort must be reserved for human reason. Thus, if magic be deduced immediately from elementary processes of reasoning, and be, in fact, an error into which the mind falls almost spontaneously, while religion rests on conceptions which the merely animal intelligence can hardly be supposed to have yet attained to, it becomes probable that magic arose before religion in the evolution of our race, and that man essayed to bend nature to his wishes by the sheer force of spells and enchantments before he strove to coax and mollify a coy, capricious, or irascible deity by the soft insinuation of prayer and sacrifice. The conclusion, which we have thus reached deductively from a consideration of the fundamental ideas of magic and religion, is confirmed inductively by the observation that among the aborigines of Australia, the rudest savages as to whom we possess accurate information, magic is universally practiced, whereas religion, in the sense of propitiation or conciliation of the higher powers, seems to be nearly unknown. Roughly speaking, all men in Australia are magicians, but not one is a priest. Everybody fancies he can influence his fellows or the course of nature by sympathetic magic, but nobody dreams of propitiating gods by prayer and sacrifice. But if in the most backward state of human society, now known to us, we find magic thus conspicuously present and religious conspicuously absent, may we not reasonably conjecture that the civilized races of the world have also, at some period of their history, passed through a similar intellectual phase, that they attempted to force the great powers of nature to do their pleasure before they thought of courting their favor by offerings and prayer. In short, that, just as on the material side of human culture there has everywhere been an age of stone, so on the intellectual side there has everywhere been an age of magic? There are reasons for answering this question in the affirmative. When we survey the existing races of mankind from Greenland to Tierra del Fuego, or from Scotland to Singapore, we observe that they are distinguished one from the other by a great variety of religions, and that these distinctions are not, so to speak, merely coterminous with the broad distinctions of race, but descend into the minuter subdivisions of states and commonwealths, nay, that they honeycomb the town, the village, and even the family, so that the surface of society all over the world is cracked and seamed, sapped and mined with rents and fissures and yawning crevices opened up by the disintegrating influence of religious dissension. Yet, when we have penetrated through these differences, which affect mainly the intelligent and thoughtful part of the community, we shall find underlying them all a solid stratum of intellectual agreement among the dull, the weak, the ignorant, and the superstitious, who constitute, unfortunately, the vast majority of mankind. One of the great achievements of the 19th century was to run shafts down into the low mental stratum in many parts of the world, and thus to discover its substantial identity everywhere. It is beneath our feet, and not very far beneath them, here in Europe at the present day, and it crops up on the surface in the heart of the Australian wilderness, and wherever the advent of a higher civilization has not crushed it underground. This universal faith, this truly Catholic creed, is a belief in the efficacy of magic. While religious systems differ not only in different countries, but in the same country in different ages, the system of sympathetic magic remains everywhere, and at all times substantially alike in its principles and practice. Among the ignorant and superstitious classes of modern Europe, it is very much what it was thousands of years ago in Egypt and India, and what it now is among the lowest savages surviving in the remotest corners of the world. If the test of truth lay in the show of hands, or a counting of heads, the system of magic might appeal, with far more reason than the Catholic Church, to the proud motto, quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus, as the sure and certain credential of its own infallibility. It is not our business here to consider what bearing the permanent existence of such a solid layer of savagery beneath the surface of society, and unaffected by the superficial changes of religion and culture, has upon the future of humanity. The dispassionate observer, whose studies have led him to plume its depths, can hardly regard it otherwise than as a standing menace to civilization. We seem to move on a thin crust, which may at any moment be rent by the subterranean forces slumbering below. From time to time, a hollow murmur underground, or a sudden spurt of flame into the air, tells of what is going on beneath our feet. Now and then the polite world is startled by a paragraph in a newspaper which tells how in Scotland an image has been found stuck full of pins for the purpose of killing an obnoxious laird or minister, how a woman has been slowly roasted to death as a witch in Ireland, or how a girl has been murdered and chopped up in Russia to make those candles of human tallow by whose light thieves hope to pursue their midnight trade unseen. But whether the influences that make for further progress, or those that threaten to undo what has already been accomplished, will ultimately prevail, whether the impulsive energy of the minority, or the dead weight of the majority of mankind will prove the stronger force to carry us up to higher heights or to sink us into lower depths, are questions rather for the sage, the moralist, and the statesman, whose eagle vision scans the future, than for the humble student of the present and the past. Here we are only concerned to ask how far the uniformity, the universality, and the permanence of a belief in magic, compared with the endless variety and the shifting character of religious creeds, raises a presumption that the former represents a ruder and earlier phase of the human mind, through which all the races of mankind have passed or are passing on their way to religion and science. If an age of religion has thus everywhere, as I venture to surmise, been preceded by an age of magic, it is natural that we should inquire that causes have led mankind, or rather a portion of them, to abandon magic as a principle of faith and practice, and to betake themselves to religion instead. When we reflect upon the multitude, the variety, and the complexity of the facts to be explained, and the scantiness of our information regarding them, we shall be ready to acknowledge that a full and satisfactory solution of so profound a problem is hardly to be hoped for, and that the most we can do in the present state of our knowledge is to hazard a more or less plausible conjecture. With all due diffidence, then, I would suggest that a tardy recognition of the inherent falsehood and barrenness of magic set the more thoughtful part of mankind to cast about for a truer theory of nature and more fruitful method of turning her resources to account. The shrewder intelligences must in time have come to perceive that magical ceremonies and incantations did not really affect the results which they were designed to produce, and which the majority of their simpler fellows still believed that they did actually produce. This great discovery of the inefficiency of magic must have wrought a radical, though probably slow revolution in the minds of those who had the sagacity to make it. The discovery amounted to this, that men for the first time recognized their inability to manipulate at pleasure certain natural forces, which hitherto they had believed to be completely within their control. It was a confession of human ignorance and weakness. Man saw that he had taken for causes that were no causes, and that all his efforts to work by means of these imaginary causes had been vain. His painful toil had been wasted. His curious ingenuity had been squandered to no purpose. He had been pulling at strings to which nothing was attached. He had been marching, as he thought, straight to the goal, while in reality he had only been treading in a narrow circle. Not that the effects which he had striven so hard to produce did not continue to manifest themselves. They were still produced, but not by him. The rain still fell on the thirsty ground. The sun still pursued his daily, and the moon her nightly journey across the sky. The silent procession of the seasons still moved in light and shadow, in cloud and sunshine across the earth. Men were still born to labor and sorrow, and still, after a brief sojourn here, were gathered to their fathers in the long home hereafter. All things indeed went on as before, yet all seemed different to him from whose eyes the old scales had fallen. For he could no longer cherish the pleasing illusion that it was he who guided the earth and the heaven in their courses, and that they could cease to perform their great revolutions were he to take his feeble hand from the wheel. In the death of his enemies and his friends, he no longer saw proof of the resistless potency of his own or of hostile enchantments. He now knew that friends and foes alike had succumbed to a force stronger than any that he could wield, and in obedience to a destiny which he was powerless to control. Thus cut adrift from his ancient moorings, and left to toss in a troubled sea of doubt and uncertainty, his old happy confidence in himself and his powers rudely shaken, our primitive philosopher must have been sadly perplexed and agitated till he came to rest, as in a quiet haven, after a tempestuous voyage, in a new system of faith and practice, which seemed to offer a solution of his harassing doubts and a substitute, however precarious, for the sovereignty over nature which he had reluctantly abdicated. If the great world went on its way without the help of him or his fellows, it must surely be because there were other beings like himself, but far stronger, who, unseen themselves, directed its course and brought about all the varied series of events which he had hitherto believed to be dependent on his own magic. It was they, as he now believed, and not he himself, who made the stormy wind to blow, the lightning to flash, and the thunder to roll, who had laid the foundations of the solid earth, and set bounds to the restless sea, that it might not pass, who caused all the glorious lights of heaven to shine, who gave the fowls of the air their meat, and the wild beasts of the desert their prey, who bade the fruitful land to bring forth in abundance, the high hills to be clothed with forests, the bubbling springs to rise under the rocks in the valleys, and green pastures to grow by still waters, who breathed into man's nostrils and made him live, or turned him to destruction by famine and pestilence and war, To these mighty beings, whose handiwork he traced in all the gorgeous and varied pageantry of nature, man now addressed himself humbly, confessing his dependence on their invisible power, and beseeching them of their mercy to furnish him with all good things, to defend him from the perils and dangers by which our mortal life is compassed about on every hand, and finally to bring his immortal spirit, freed from the burden of the body, to some happier world, beyond the reach of pain and sorrow, where he might rest with them, and with the spirits of good men in joy and felicity forever. In this, or some such way as this, the deeper minds may be conceived to have made the great transition from magic to religion, but even in them the change can hardly ever have been sudden. Probably it proceeded very slowly, and required long ages for its more or less perfect accomplishment. For the recognition of man's powerlessness to influence the course of nature on a grand scale must have been gradual. He cannot have been shorn of the whole of his fancied dominion at a blow. Step by step he must have been driven back from his proud position. Foot by foot he must have yielded with a sigh the ground which he had once viewed as his own. Now it would be the wind, now the rain, now the sunshine, now the thunder, that he confessed himself unable to wield at all, and as province after province of nature thus fell from his grasp, till what had once seemed a kingdom threatened to shrink into a prison, man must have been more and more profoundly impressed with a sense of his own helplessness, and the might of the invisible beings by whom he believed himself to be surrounded. Thus religion, beginning as a slight and partial acknowledgment of power superior to man, tends with the growth of knowledge to deepen into a confession of man's entire and absolute dependence on the divine. His old free bearing is exchanged for an attitude of lowliest prostration before the mysterious powers of the unseen, and his highest virtue is to submit his will to theirs. In la sua volatande et nostra pace. But this deepening sense of religion, this more perfect submission to the divine will in all things, affects only those higher intelligences who have breadth of view enough to comprehend the vastness of the universe and the littleness of man. Small minds cannot grasp great ideas. To their narrow comprehension, their purblind vision, nothing seems really great and important but themselves. Such minds hardly rise into religion at all. They are, indeed, drilled by their betters into an outward conformity with its precepts and a verbal profession of its tenets. But at heart they cling to their old magical superstitions, which may be discountenanced and forbidden, but cannot be eradicated by religion, so long as they have their roots deep down in the mental framework and constitution of the great majority of mankind. The reader may well be tempted to ask, how was it that intelligent men did not sooner detect the fallacy of magic? How could they continue to cherish expectations that were invariably doomed to disappoint? With what heart persist in playing venerable antics that led to nothing, and mumbling solemn balderdash that remained without effect? Why cling to beliefs which were so flatly contradicted by experience? How dare to repeat experiments that had failed so often? The answer seems to be that the fallacy was far from easy to detect, the failure by no means obvious, since in many, perhaps in most cases, the desired event did actually follow, at a longer or a shorter interval. The performance of the rite which was designed to bring it about, and a mind of more than common acuteness was needed to perceive that. Even in these cases, the rite was not necessarily the cause of the event. A ceremony intended to make the wind blow or the rain fall, or to work the death of an enemy, will always be followed sooner or later by the occurrence it is meant to bring to pass. The primitive man may be excused for regarding the occurrence as a direct result of the ceremony, and the best possible proof of its efficacy. Similarly, rites observed in the morning to help the sun to rise, and in spring to wake the dreaming earth from her winter sleep, will invariably appear to be crowned with success, at least within the temperate zones. For in these regions, the sun lights his golden lamp in the east every morning, and year by year the vernal earth decks herself afresh with a rich mantle of green. Hence, the practical savage, with his conservative instincts, might well turn a deaf ear to the subtleties of the theoretical doubter, the philosophic radical, who presumed to hint that sunrise and spring might not, after all, be direct consequences of the punctual performance of certain daily or yearly ceremonies, and that the sun might perhaps continue to rise and trees to blossom though the ceremonies were occasionally intermitted or even discontinued altogether. These skeptical doubts would naturally be repelled by the other with scorn and indignation, as airy reveries subversive of the faith and manifestly contradicted by experience. Can anything be plainer, he might say, than that I light my twopenny candle on earth, and that the sun then kindles his great fire in heaven? I should be glad to know whether, when I have put my green robe in spring, the trees do not afterwards do the same. These are facts patent to everybody, and on them I take my stand. I am a plain, practical man, not one of your theorists and splitters of hairs and choppers of logic, theories and speculation, and all that may be very well in their way, and I have not the least objection to your indulging in them, provided, of course, you do not put them in practice. But give me leave to stick to facts when I know where I am. The fallacy of this reasoning is obvious to us, because it happens to deal with facts about which we have long made up our minds. But let an argument of precisely the same caliber be applied to matters which are still under debate, and it may be questioned whether a British audience would not applaud it as sound, and esteem the speaker who used it a safe man. Not brilliant or showy, perhaps, but thoroughly sensible and hard-headed. If such reasonings could pass muster among ourselves, need we wonder that they long escaped detection by the savage? Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next installment. In the meantime, you can catch up with our other pod, Midwest Covencast. Consider supporting Midwest Covencast and Weekend Reads on our Patreon to gain access to additional content and exclusive Coven merch. You can even join our Coven by following us on social media at Midwest Covencast on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and at Midwest Coven on Twitter. You can also keep up with us on our website, MidwestCovencast.com. Until next time, Coven, blessed be.